Colleen and I will be back with a news update at the top of the hour, but now back to Donna and more of your phone calls.
All right, Jim and Colleen, thanks very much. And we took a pause in our conversation with General Wesley Clark. General Clark, the former NATO commander, as you might remember, and a CNN military consultant currently with us. General Clark, you heard the CNN Time poll said a majority overwhelmingly want to see some tough military action. We were just talking about that before we took a pause to get up to date with the news. But how? You were talking about command and control, and I brought up that they try to do that in the Sudan. How do you go in and make it effective without letting things spiral out of control?
Got to be smart. Got to have good information. We're developing those targets now. I'm very confident. We've done a lot of work inside the U.S. Armed Forces and the intelligence community on Osama bin Laden since 1998. We know a whole lot more now than we did then. And when we strike, if we find an effective way to strike, I'm confident it'll be a pinpoint strike that has real impact. Now, one of the other things we learned, though, in that episode of 1998 is you got to make sure the moderate Arab governments and our allies around the world understand what we're doing, because as Secretary
and support, worldwide support.
As Secretary Powell said, this is a multi-dimensional effort. You have to have diplomatic support, you have to have legal support, you have to have economic support, and ultimately these terrorists are going to be crushed by domestic pressures in each of the countries that cut off their support, and that's what we want to encourage.
You mentioned Osama bin Laden. He's not the only one that people would probably classify, even through the intelligence community, as a terrorist. Do we have any idea worldwide the number of cells, the number of networks of terrorists at all?
Well, we know there's an interlocking network, and Osama bin Laden is one among several. He's, in many cases, considered the chief financial backer and perhaps the overall coordinator. He may or may not have been the lead planner in this operation.
Yeah, and that
but there are more than 24 countries in which there are cells. There are any number of cells in these countries, and maybe 50,000 people or more have gone through various militant Islamic training centers.
50,000?
Maybe that many. They fought in Afghanistan. They fought in various places during the operations in the Balkans. There were some who came into Bosnia. Some married. Some were still there in Bosnia. We knew when we were trying to work in Kosovo that there were continued charges of radical Islamic fighters in Kosovo. We couldn't find much evidence of that, but they're in many different places and many cells around the world.
You trained leaders and soldiers for 5 years. A lot of them went to Desert Storm. Is the United States trained to fight a war against terrorists?
We've got the best armed forces in the world. It's not just an armed forces action, though. Primarily, it's a police action
and
intelligence action first. We've got great special operations forces if we have to go in and do something precise. We've got high technology, the most highly trained and disciplined, greatest soldiers and airmen involved that anybody has in the world. And we've got large conventional forces to back it up.
Evelyn is on the phone with us from California. Thank you for hanging on, Evelyn. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just calling in response to your question on whether or not you feel the U.S. should retaliate. And I feel that most of the United States, as much as we fear retaliation and what it might do to us, that we feel as a nation that we need to retaliate.
There is that thought, right, that we must retaliate, that the United States must retaliate or it would look weak, but then there are those who worry that it could spiral out of control, that it will get into this endless cycle of violence. What do you think about that,
We
General
have to
Clark?
keep in mind the long-term objective. The long-term objective is to go after the terrorist networks, to deprive them of support, to eliminate these individuals one way or another. Ideally, bring them to justice, put them on trial, convict them of their crimes, and take whatever measures justice. If they resist arrest or detention, then we'll use other means on them. But the idea is to focus on the long term and then take the steps necessary one by one to get there. What we want to do is be as precise as possible so we get at the threat. What we don't want to do is turn this campaign into something it doesn't have to be. This is not World War II. We don't have an enemy nation.
Could it come to that, though? Could it come to that? Or is the support so widespread for the United States, even now at this beginning, that the support would be great enough that it could be taken care of in a fairly rapid fashion?
We have the moral high ground. Our actions have to reinforce our morality, our compliance with international law, and our superior intelligence.
don't you think a lot of folks worry about if it could get into a protracted battle and if it could go on and on if we were to get into a battle?
Well, I think people are very concerned about this, and it's a strange feeling in the American public. I've had a lot of people say we must retaliate, but then right after that they say, but we're worried about what happens next. And I think what we have to recognize is to win, and we have to win this because our nation and our way of life are at stake. We have to succeed, but to succeed we have to do it in a smart fashion. We have to think of the long term, and we have to prepare ourselves for a campaign, not a single strike, not 2 strikes, but something that is going to last months and perhaps years to defeat this if we do this the right way.
Much of the same that I hear on those 2 points, too. Must retaliate, but worried as well. Jim, you're on the phone from Texas with us. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi, go right ahead.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
I'd like to address a point that you made just a minute ago about the on and on thing that's going on. You know, people are worried about the violence that could continue on and on.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that's been going on for a long time anyway. We've always been under the threat of this. And even though the public doesn't hear about it, there's a lot of attacks that have been thwarted that people just don't hear about. And so the battle's been going on and on anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And people are concerned about that continuing on if we retaliate. Well, that's going to happen anyway.
All right.
Even if we don't retaliate, it's still going to continue on, and so we have to.
Jim, I think you're exactly right on that. I just don't label it retaliation. I label it part of another campaign. But I think we also have to recognize that even though this attack, or this wave of attacks seems to be over, we fully expect that there are other efforts underway or being planned against us. So we have to move forward and take action to disrupt this.
But a word you've mentioned over and over, have to do it smartly. Let's bring in our Major Garrett. He is at the White House, and he is privy to some of the information that's coming out of there, certainly, and what they're trying to look at and put plans together. Major?
Well, Donna, as you've been discussing, the President is reviewing all available options. As the Secretary of State has pointed out, this is multidimensional. Military is certainly at the top of the list of the various options the President and his national security team are exploring. But there's also diplomatic, economic means of trying to tighten the noose around terrorist cells around the world. All of those options are being discussed. The President will continue throughout the weekend to have intensive discussions with his national security team to look at all of these options. He is now armed, if you will, with the legislative will of the Congress to prosecute a war against those responsible for the abominable terrorist acts on September 11th. Armed with that and the very strong unified will of the American people and the unity expressed across the globe, the President is well positioned to prosecute this war. And as General Clark pointed out, we have the moral high ground, the moral authority to carry out this war. It will be protracted in many respects, experts believe, and also, as the Secretary of State outlined, multidimensional. So it's not just about a military response, be it very swift or down the road. Military is clearly a component of that, but also diplomatic, economic means of isolating, tightening a noose, and in some ways, whether it be swiftly or in a more protracted way, completely isolating to the point of nullity these terrorist cells.
Major Garrett at the White House, thanks very much. And of course, that use of force resolution says all necessary and appropriate force. What do you think is necessary and appropriate? What would you say, and how long do you think it could be? Sooner rather than later, before a response would come?
Well, it will depend on a lot of information that really isn't available to us in the public. But we do think that we have a very active target development process, and we need to use the right force to disrupt his operations. Whether that's an insertion of a raid, whether it's cruise missiles or long-range air, or whether it's the police cracking down on a terrorist cell in some city overseas. Those are, we need a grand campaign plan that puts that first response, but we don't have time to spare. We need to be moving just as we are.
What do you mean by that? Why don't we have time to spare? Because they're on the move?
That's right. And an organization that's this effective and this complex has more than one play in its playbook. And there's something else that's being rehearsed or prepared or maybe staged to go against us now. So we want to take as rapid action as possible, but we want to be effective and we want to have the support of our allies. And I think what the congressional resolution does is authorize the president to do precisely that without tying his hands. So whether it's with high-performance aircraft or cruise missiles or our soldiers or policemen in another country that we have to support, whatever it is, that's what we've got the authorization to do, I think.
Ground campaign with this, in your opinion?
Well, perhaps eventually, but I don't see a ground campaign in the offing. There's no country. We're not invading a country here, and there's been a lot of talk about Afghanistan, but, I mean, frankly, no one has wanted to invade Afghanistan and hold it for any reasons other than what we saw the Russians try to do in the 1980s. They weren't very successful. We probably could be, but why do we want to be? That's their own country. What we want to do is get rid of the terrorist network.
And the High Holy Leader said that Osama bin Laden would not have been able to do this, couldn't train there, he's already moved, and some of the aid workers are pulling out now, and in some concern to a lot of folks, then a lot of innocent people face starvation and attacks, and the people who had money could get out, but others are stuck there. Let's go on to David. Is that right, David in Chicago? Thank you. Hi, David, you're on the air.
Hello, how you doing?
Good. Hope you're the same.
Thank you for taking my call.
You bet.
I believe the U.S. must and should retaliate, especially the way General Clark just explained it. It has to be targeted, strategic. It can't be just one big thing sending tons of troops down to Afghanistan, trying to take over the country, or different places trying to hunt the main person down, and then because that way you're going to get a lot of innocent people that maybe are good people. They're just poor. They're under the influence of the not the dictatorship, but the people are running Afghanistan right now.
Taliban, that's right. What about that, General Clark? Is Afghanistan looked at this point as sticking out? Pakistan said it wanted to think about the options about, the United States going to General Musharraf and taking a look at this and saying, okay, what's your cooperation factor here? As I heard earlier this evening, Pakistan has decided that it will cooperate with the United States. But does this mean
Afghanistan hasn't yet, because the Taliban are very dependent on the Mujahideen that came there during the war against the Russians and are still there in a large community of Arab fighters in fighting their own civil war. But perhaps the Taliban needs to recalculate, because
how likely are they to do that?
I don't know. It depends on what connections we may get. Because Osama bin Laden has been
there apparently for a couple of years.
He's been there,
at least.
and he's heavily supported, but also there are connections between Pakistan and the Taliban. And if General Musharraf really supports us the way he says he does, maybe he's going to pull connections. My point would be, we're not interested in Afghanistan per se. We're interested in smashing a terrorist network. And it just so happens that we believe that part of that terrorist network, or perhaps the hub of it, may be located there. But it's not a matter of attacking airfields or factories or facilities. It's a matter of individuals. Those individuals need to be identified, tracked, detained, and turned over to the United States and the world community for justice. That's what the Taliban needs to do if they truly believe in God and the professions of morality, which the mainstream of Islam does.
Could they face other pressure from other Middle Eastern countries? Could they make some headway in talking to the Taliban?
Well, perhaps they could, and that's certainly one of the courses of action that I think General Powell has outlined, our diplomatic approach.
Yeah, and at the State Department today, before that national prayer service, there was quite a showing of support as they headed on buses to go and signing condolence books. And as they headed to that prayer service, a couple of the diplomats that I saw on wire reports said that maybe the United States doesn't realize just how strong the worldwide support is at this point. Let's go for a little perspective to our Garrick Utley. He's in New York. Hi, Garrick.
Hi, Donna. I think every conversation, particularly important conversations, very emotional ones about our future, such as this, may have a place for a devil's advocate. So let me just raise a couple of points. It's clear, as we've all been seeing, there's a great need and desire for some kind of action to be taken. A moment ago, you showed the very interesting results of the CNN Time poll, which shows that 62% say it thought that Congress should declare war. Clearly understood the reasons for that. But the next question on the poll: who should Congress declare war against? Answer, 61% saying, we don't know. And I think there in this poll that was taken, the CNN Time poll, we see the confusion, the uncertainty that lurks there sort of as a subtext along with this desire to take action. And the other comment I would make is simply that I think we all know that this word war has been diluted. We've had all kinds of war on drugs, a war on poverty, and now it's going to be war on terrorism. A new war. That's what we'd be calling a new war. Now, Donna, military action, I think, is going to be coming clearly. If we get lucky and if we're smart, as the general says, we're going to maybe send in some cruise missiles or other kinds of airstrikes if we know where bin Laden is or his associates are. But it's also going to be necessary, and we have to keep this in mind, to satisfy the public demand for action. And this puts a leader, the President of the United States, in a very difficult position. He only wants to act smartly when he knows he can accomplish something. At the same time, he has to satisfy what we saw today when he was visiting those rescue workers in New York chanting USA, USA, USA. Well, something will certainly happen in the coming weeks or the coming months, but I suspect in the long run, I'd like to hear the General's comments on this, that what this may turn out to be is very similar to the war on drugs. If you listen to what General Clark has been saying, the language he's been using, which is very well spoken, it's similar to the language that's been used on the war on drugs for many years. We got to get in and get those networks. We're not fighting countries. We got to get good intelligence information. We got to get hold of their leaders. From time to time we succeed. A drug cartel kingpin like Pablo Escobar is removed from the scene. But the war on drugs goes on and on and on without a victory, without a defeat. It just goes on, and I think that war on terrorism may be the same thing in the offing.
All right, Garrett Utley in New York, thanks very much. Is that right? Is that your feeling too, General Clark, that this will just go on
I'm very
and on
concerned
and on?
about this. And that's
Must
why
we always watch out for terrorism? I mean, we had to before, but even more now until the end of time?
Well, I think there will always be those who somehow react against the United States or other leading powers who are driving the pace of modernization and economic development and technological progress in the world. Whether they will always resort to force and violence to murder our citizens, that's another matter. And I think that it very much depends on how we handle this campaign now. Certainly these people who did this are embittered. They're very ideological and dogmatic, and we're not going to talk them out of what they're doing. So we have to isolate them, cut them off, bring them to justice, or otherwise handle this situation. How we do this will determine whether others follow them. And in that sense, it's a little bit different than the war on drugs because the motivation is different and the consequences are different. This is so shocking. This is so horrifying what's happened in Washington and New York City that we clearly have the moral high ground. We have the ability to mobilize most of the leadership in the entire world to come to our aid to deal with these networks. It's a very tough dilemma the President's in because Americans want rapid action, but it has to be effective action in view of our long-term objectives, not just a spasm of response to satisfy an irate American public. Goodness knows we're all angry about this, but we've got to strike smart.
Effective, and I was just going to say the word you keep using is smart, and the President said this would be a monumental battle between good and evil, but that good would win out, and the President is under an enormous amount of pressure.
Yes.
Major Garrett at the White House.
Donna, let me tackle this from a couple of different angles. Picking up on Garrett's first point about the pressure he believes the President is under. Clearly the White House feels it. Senior advisors to the President feel it. But I commend to all of us the President's first statement from the Oval Office on that Tuesday night after he returned to the Oval Office from traveling around the country because of the very real security danger afflicting and focused on Air Force One. There were several drafts of that speech, I have been told, many of them much tougher than the speech the President delivered. Much, much tougher, I have been told by some senior White House advisors. The President toned those remarks down. He did not want to strike an immediate tone of vengeance or bloodlust from the Oval Office. What he wanted to try to do was send as calm and as reassuring signal as he could to the nation and to the rest of the world about the temperate and balanced approach he was going to take. Any president under those circumstances would have felt the very real compulsion to talk in words of vengeance, to sort of strike at that very real sense of outrage and horror all Americans felt. The President decided that he would do it a bit differently, and there was some internal second-guessing the next day within the White House. Was he strong enough? Did he strike as strong a note as the American public needed, they thought, some thought, the public needed to hear? President had no second guessing about that statement, and he has gradually stepped up the rhetoric in consistent methodology, we are told, as the military apparatus, as the intelligence service has gathered more information, and the president has become more internally confident about his ability to deal with this situation in a timely and effective manner. So I would only refer the nation to the president's own remarks, and you have seen him move in a direction steadily, but he resisted the temptation on that very first evening to be harsh and bellicose, even though some of those very type words were laid before him as options. He rejected them. And on Garrick's other point about the drug war, I can tell you this. The White House sees no analogy whatsoever, and in fact has spoken about the drug war in different terms. This president has often, even in the company of leaders from Peruvian countries who suffer much more gravely the real tragedies of the drug war than many Americans do, about the fault that lies in America on the demand side of this equation. So he's even spoken differently about the drug war. But this is not analogous in any way at this Bush White House. The victims of the terrorism attacks on Tuesday were innocent American civilians who never once brought anything approaching the harm that fell upon them in their direction, as the president has often argued Americans do who take drugs. So they don't see any analogy whatsoever with the drug war or its protracted and in some cases endless struggle. They do believe and are becoming ever more confident that they can find those responsible for these acts of terrorism and bring about, as the president has said, justice.
Major
Donna?
Garrett, Major, thanks very much. Let's go to Jeremiah in Georgia on the phone with us right now. Jeremiah?
I was calling towards the question of if we should take retaliation.
Jeremiah, could you start over for a minute? I missed the first part of what you were saying. Could you start over, please?
Yeah, I was calling in for the question, should we retaliate or not? I believe we should, because they were able to penetrate our security at the airport, and we were supposed to have a strong security then. Who says they're not going to be stupid enough or gutsy enough to try it again in a different form? You know, who says they're not going to put a bomb there in a car or something wild and crazy? Where do they come with these ideas anyway, and what have we done wrong to them for them to kill thousands of our innocent citizens for no reason?
General Clark, there's been some talk about, wondering who the enemy is, and I saw some wire reports and some of our reporting talking about that there were worries now still that perhaps this isn't all over and done with, that they were worried about further terrorist attacks and maybe in different forms. And we've had the first arrest, I think you've known with the updates on news here that we've been telling you about, one of the arrests of one of the people who was taken into custody, I believe, at one of the two New York airports on Thursday evening. I think it was JFK or LaGuardia. Those were, they took in like 10 or 12 people, and now they've had the first arrest. So what do you do to watch out, like Jeremiah says, for what could be coming in the next wave?
Well, you have to go back and go through a security analysis of all of your vulnerable systems. The airports, certainly, but also other things, our utilities, our public services. There's much more horrifying scenarios that could be constructed than what happened. And we need to make sure those scenarios never happen. So that's the first battle we're waging right now in the United States. Now, we don't know if we're winning or not, but we've got to do our best.
Well, I saw, too, the FBI was saying, although this person did not pass the lie detector test, so they're saying that perhaps this isn't accurate as they thought before, but there was a warning that maybe Boston, Atlanta, Richmond, Virginia might have also been targets during Tuesday's attacks. So now they wonder, because he didn't pass the lie detector test where they got some of this information, but they were talking about people are worried who work in skyscrapers. They're nervous about that, and that gun sales are up. Particularly, they're edgy in Boston, where the first two planes that hit the World Trade Center towers hit.
Well, I think it would be really surprising if he only had 4 teams, and 3 of the 4 teams took over and were successful, in this case with these aircraft. So we don't know how many teams there really were and how many people are fleeing across the country trying to get away or waiting to try it in a different manner.
I'm sorry, Rick, could you tell me who the next caller is? Once again, Laura, Arizona. Hi, Arizona. Go right ahead.
Yeah, my point is, first of all, I really hope President Bush understands that we will be patient enough for them to do the smart thing. And I don't think the question is if we should retaliate. I think it's going to be how we're going to retaliate, because I believe as a world we're trying to unite, to come together. This is the extortionist, and we need, any terrorist is just an extortionist. We need to, number one, figure out how to take away their power, how to really get to them as a world. We're all not going to put up with this. If some country wants to declare war, they need to declare war on us, like we're saying. Who are we going to retaliate against? An individual? And so I think they're on the right track. They're going to do the right thing, and I think most Americans have complete confidence in our leaders, and they're all seeming that they're going to get it right this time.
Laura
and
from
I'm
Arizona.
confident.
Thank you very much for your call. Did you finish your thought? Were you able to finish your thought there?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But I think everyone so far, I think that our country's finally going to pull together, like the general said, and lead the world in showing how to get rid of terrorists once and for all, because you let extortionists in, they're going to keep doing it.
General Clark, what about that? You were involved, as we said before, 5 years. You trained leaders and soldiers, and many of them went to Desert Storm. How is the patience factor? Laura mentioned that, the United States, folks in the United States, she feels a lot of them would be patient. What do you think? Is there patience?
Factor in the armed forces is great. The
Right.
patience
How about the
factor in the
general
American public? Well, I think we're going to go through a certain set of stages after this campaign. I mean, first we're angry right now, and we're grieving right now. But I think as more of the facts come out, I think people will rally behind the president. He's going to set the pace of this based on the information that's given to him, what our capabilities are, and what makes sense, and I think the American people will support it. I think we're a mature population, and I think we certainly can hold our horses until we do the right thing in this.
General Clark, we're glad to have you here with us in Atlanta, our military consultant and former NATO commander. Thank you very much. As we carry on here, news that we've been bringing you, now they have 4 of the black boxes that have been found. One from the plane that hit the Pentagon and one from the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. Let's get the latest news for you with Jim Clancy and Colleen McEdwards. Jim and Colleen?